Subsequent to a number of marches against gender-based violence, a summit happened where a national declaration was adopted which articulates 17 commitments towards addressing these crimes at government level. Following this, international activists have since been inspired to speak out even more to make change in their own countries. Through Men Engage Africa Alliance, there is now a formation of 22 country networks who will host various activities across the continent to observe the 16 days of activism, no violence against women and children. So to tell us a little bit more about the alliance, we're joined in studio by Mpiwe Mangwiro Tsanga, Regional Campaign and Advocacy Specialist at Men Engage Africa Alliance. Thanks for coming in. Good to have you here on Morning Live.
Morning, and thank you for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So you have interacted with your counterparts from various countries around the continent, and you've spoken intensely about gender-based violence. Perhaps you can describe what the crime levels are like in these countries you've spoken to.
All right. So as you have just initially highlighted, we work across 22 countries in the continent as an alliance that is called Men Engage Africa. So what we notice as we work, because we work to advocate to address issues of gender justice, human rights and HIV/AIDS, which issues are intertwined and cumulatively contribute to the high and escalating levels of gender-based violence that are predominantly affecting women and girls. And what we notice is gender-based violence is generally a scourge that is a big challenge across the continent. It takes various forms and shapes. You find that because we also work in conflict and post-conflict environments, there you find that the levels are quite very high, because in conflict times women bear the brunt of the war. They become the objects, they are abused, they are raped, they are taken in, even as warring parties are trying to punish each other. They often target women and girls. So you find that in areas, in countries such as the DRC, we have very, very, very high levels of violence and very minimal interventions because of the state of what happens in a war when systems are not fully functioning or fall apart. Then you find that when we go to the East Africa side, in some West African countries, violence also takes the other form of harmful norms and practices such as female genital mutilation, such as child marriages, which also contribute, including, that's in addition to the physical, the emotional, the financial and the psychosocial forms of violence that we witness in every other part of the country. So in general, I would say we experience, although the percentages and the degrees may be varying, the scourge of gender-based violence is quite high across the continent, and it still remains a very big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's frightening what you're saying, because we all know it exists, but it's when you hear it spoken about and you actually see it and experience it that you realize that this continent has a very, very far way to go. I mean, and I'm not saying it's something that only exists here, but the conditions that the citizens of Africa are living in certain war-torn countries, and these countries that really have no active government that's actually there protecting the woman. And that's, I suppose, the question that I need to ask you. How committed is government to trying to fight this scourge? Or are there just so many other issues that this almost falls through?
I think I could speak even in general terms and say generally across the continent, gender-based violence is not the biggest priority for any country. Even if we're to bring it here to South Africa, we see that it has taken a lot of action, a lot of marching and protests for even the first gender summit to be held in the country. So you find that even across the continent, there is laws. Many countries, I would say, have laws that speak to gender-based violence, the Domestic Violence Act, your Sexual Offences Act. There are quite a number of countries across the continent that have these laws in places, but the biggest challenge is always the implementation. Yeah. There are no resources that are adequate. There are no adequate resources that are allocated to effectively implement. So you find that when governments get to international platforms and podiums, they always speak about the laws that they have, and it all looks so clean on paper.
On paper, looks great.
It looks so great, but the reality on the ground leaves a lot more to be desired. You find that even lack of political will, the government, the state institutions, they will have the policies and the laws, but there's no political will. In many countries, domestic violence is still treated as a private issue to be addressed privately within the family. That's also because of the cultural and social norms that tend to place women at a lower status than men.
Yeah.
So there's always that comes with that level of entitlement that a man can discipline their spouse, you know, or a partner can beat their wife or their girlfriend, those kind of things. So you find that even when it comes to reporting, it's very difficult for women to come out because already the societal norms, the power imbalances are not, and even poverty plays a big role because you have many women in this continent are dependent on their partners, their spouses and counterparts. So it becomes difficult for one to come out, also knowing that the chances of prosecution are slim.
Well, they certainly are. And also, I mean, you hear stories, you know, we hear stories in South Africa all the time about women that do find themselves in situations where they've either been abused or they've been raped, and they try and report it to the police, and the way they are treated, and the justice system just fails them every single time, and the perpetrator gets away with it. We heard this here, but I had a very interesting conversation with Jacina Michelle, who just happens to be the daughter of the late Samora Michelle and Graça Michelle. Now, she is the daughter of a former president, and she explained her situation as to how horrific it was when she was abused and she needed to go and report on that, and how bad it was, and the perpetrator has never faced justice. Now, that is the daughter of a first lady. Now, you talk to somebody who is poor, impoverished, has absolutely nothing, no money, and tries to report this. You'll be thrown out into the streets.
Certainly, you've captured it well. Gender-based violence knows no class.
No limits.
It knows
Absolutely.
no limits, no class, no race, no financial or economic status. Women, that's because the power imbalances that are inherent make it doesn't matter what class or what resources you have as a woman. There is generally that tendency that when it comes to the relationship between women and men, women tend to be treated as of a lower status and a lower class. It even sometimes becomes so hard for one with a social positioning like that to then come out and say, I've been abused. It sometimes it can even be difficult. So you can imagine if someone who is who is in that position and then still the perpetrator never faced justice. So think of a poor woman who's uneducated, who does not even understand how the system functions.
I know, and feels they don't have rights. So we know how bad the situation is, but I want to try and find the positive side of an organization like Men Engage Africa, that you've signed all these commitments. I'm talking 17 commitments towards addressing these goals. How does it work? What's happening? It's 22 country networks. What is Men Engage Africa going to do now?
So what I can first explain is that Men Engage Africa is an alliance. So in these 22 countries, each country has its own alliance, its own country network that then focuses on the work in country. So you find that we do have campaigns that already speak to sexual and gender-based violence. So it takes different shapes, like I explained that because gender-based violence, the prevalence takes different forms sometimes. So you find that in country, as partners, we work to focus. We have countries, for instance, in Sierra Leone, they are working very hard to ensure that the practice of FGM is abolished. And you find that in another country, then you are working because the prevalence, child marriages become the most prevalent issue. So that's working on addressing issues around child marriages that affect young girls. And you find, and obviously there's always going to be the rape, the physical assault, the emotional abuse that we all carry. So we have the campaigns that work in country, but we also carry the campaigns regionally, where we then engage with regional economic blocks like your SADC, like your East Africa community, where we then go and say, can you ensure that you hold your member states accountable to implementing these laws, these commitments that they have made? For instance, these are commitments that they've made in South Africa, but you find that in other countries, governments have also been making commitments. Then when we engage the regional economic blocks, we're saying, can you highlight these are the issues that need to be highlighted, and can you hold the member states accountable to implementing these dates? We also follow up to see how member states are reporting on their implementation on these issues to ensure that we highlight the gaps that need to be done. So we work at a level where we engage from a policy perspective in the region, but we also work from a level where we say implementing in country. We then also hold governments and states accountable to implementing what they have committed to. And in this way, our approach is to engage men and boys, that they also be involved, because many a time gender-based violence and gender-related issues are always relegated to women's issue, but we're saying everyone has a role to play. So men and boys also have a role to play, and they also need to be held accountable to bringing an end to this scourge.
All right, we need to leave it there. Thank you for talking to us here about the scourge of abuse across the continent. It's not something that we only battle with, but it is something that our African counterparts are doing. They're coming together. It's now 22 countries across Africa that this network is active, and they are sharing experience, working together and trying to end gender-based violence. Mpiwe Mangwiro Tsanga is a regional campaign and advocacy specialist. We thank you for coming in and talking to us on Morning Live. All right, let's take a break. We'll hear from you after that. We'll take a look at some of your tweets. Do stay tuned.
They say cricket is boring.